Here's a summary of the hardships Nadia and Sammy faced during the Hajj rituals based on Natasha and her illegitimate child in a Muslim society by Dr. A. Ahmed. 1. Physical harassment and violation of privacy. Nadia, traveling as a woman, experiences repeated sexual harassment in the crowded spaces of the Hajj. She is touched inappropriately by male pilgrims in the airport, on buses, and during the rituals, sometimes feeling men purposely pressing against her or touching her private areas. Even her husband's attempts to shield her are not enough to prevent these violations. 2. Overwhelming crowds and lack of gender segregation. Both Nadia and Sammy are shocked by the sheer number of people and the lack of gender segregation during the Hajj. Despite expectations of strict separation, men and women are mixed together in all spaces, including washrooms and ritual sites, making movement difficult and increasing the risk of harassment. 3. Cultural disillusionment. Nadia is surprised to find that the reality of Hajj is very different from what she was taught. Instead of a spiritual or orderly experience, she finds chaos, lack of privacy, and a disregard for women's safety and dignity. 4. Emotional and psychological strain. The constant harassment, lack of personal space, and the feeling of being unsafe cause Nadia significant emotional distress. She feels anger, humiliation, and regret for coming to the pilgrimage, and her faith in the sanctity of the rituals is shaken. 5. Exposure to unhygienic and stressful conditions. The crowded conditions, lack of proper facilities, and the stress of performing rituals in such an environment add to the physical and mental exhaustion for both Nadia and Sammy. In summary, Nadia and Sammy's experience of the Hajj is marked by sexual harassment, overwhelming crowds, lack of privacy, emotional distress, and cultural disillusionment. Instead of finding spiritual fulfillment, they face hardship, humiliation, and a loss of faith in the ritual's sanctity. Turn Nadia and Sammy, posing as a married couple for research purposes, notice striking cultural contrasts during their Hajj pilgrimage that challenge their expectations and highlight differences between their Western experiences and the realities of the Muslim world. 1. Gender segregation versus unexpected mixing. Nadia expects strict gender segregation based on what she learned about Islamic societies, but is shocked to find that during Hajj, men and women are mixed together in crowded spaces, including ritual sites and even washrooms. This lack of separation leads to discomfort and frequent harassment, contrasting sharply with the supposed ideals of modesty and separation. 2. Personal space and privacy. In Canada, Nadia and Sammy are used to personal space and privacy, especially for women. At Hajj, the overwhelming crowds and lack of boundaries mean Nadia is constantly jostled, touched, and unable to protect her privacy, which is a stark and distressing contrast to her Western expectations. 3. Treatment of women. Nadia is disturbed by the way women are treated during the pilgrimage. Instead of respect and protection, she faces sexual harassment and is blamed for any violations of her space, highlighting a gap between religious rhetoric and lived reality. 4. Ritual experience versus spiritual expectation. Both Nadia and Sammy expect the Hajj to be a deeply spiritual and orderly experience. Instead, they encounter chaos, lack of organization, and a focus on ritual performance over genuine spiritual fulfillment. This disillusionment is heightened by the commercialism and the behavior of other pilgrims. 5. Cultural disillusionment. The experience at Hajj exposes the gap between the idealized image of the Muslim world and the reality on the ground. Nadia and Sammy are surprised by the prevalence of harassment, the lack of empathy, and the indifference to suffering, which contrasts with the values of dignity and respect they associate with their life in Canada. In summary, Nadia and Sammy's Hajj experience is marked by cultural shock as they confront unexpected gender mixing, loss of privacy, disrespect toward women, chaotic rituals, and a disconnect between religious ideals and actual practice. These contrasts deepen their sense of alienation and challenge their assumptions about both Islamic and Western societies. The Hajj experience for Nadia and Sami, posing as a married couple, is a powerful lens for comparing Canadian cultural expectations with the realities they encounter during the pilgrimage. 1. Personal space and privacy. Canadian expectation. In Canada, there is a strong cultural emphasis on personal space, privacy, and respect for individual boundaries, especially for women. Hajj reality. Nadia is shocked by the overwhelming crowds, lack of boundaries, and frequent physical contact. She is repeatedly touched and harassed by male pilgrims, and there is no effective way to protect her privacy or dignity in the crowded ritual spaces. Site turn 7 fetch_file. 2. Gender relations and safety. Canadian expectation, gender equality and safety are prioritized. Harassment is socially condemned and legally actionable. Hajj reality. Despite expectations of strict gender segregation in Muslim societies, Nadia finds men and women mixed together in all spaces, including ritual sites and washrooms. She faces sexual harassment and is blamed for any violations, highlighting a gap between religious rhetoric and lived reality. 3. Order, organization, and respect. Canadian expectation. Canadians expect orderly, well-organized public events with clear rules and mutual respect. Hajj reality. Nadia and Sami encounter chaos, lack of organization, and a focus on ritual performance over genuine spiritual fulfillment. The pilgrimage is marked by disorder, pushing, and a lack of empathy or support among pilgrims. 4. Spiritual fulfillment versus disillusionment. Canadian expectation. Religious rituals are expected to be meaningful, uplifting, and respectful of participants' dignity. Hajj reality. Both Nadia and Sami are disillusioned by the commercialism, the behavior of other pilgrims, and the disconnect between the ideals of the faith and the actual experience. Instead of spiritual uplift, they feel humiliation, exhaustion, and regret. 5. Cultural disillusionment. Canadian expectation. Multicultural Canada values diversity, tolerance, and the protection of vulnerable individuals. Hajj reality. Nadia and Sami are surprised by the prevalence of harassment, the lack of empathy, and the indifference to suffering, which contrasts with the values of dignity and respect they associate with their life in Canada. In summary, the Hajj experience starkly contrasts with Canadian cultural expectations of privacy, gender equality, order, and respect. Instead of finding spiritual fulfillment and communal support, Nadia and Sami encounter chaos, harassment, and a disregard for individual dignity, deepening their sense of cultural and emotional alienation. Here's what the novel says about the origins of the Hajj rituals and the Black Stone. Origins of the Hajj rituals, as described in the novel. The novel presents the Hajj rituals as having pre-Islamic, pagan roots. It states that the pilgrimage to Mecca and the rituals associated with it were practiced by the pagan Arabs long before the rise of Islam. According to the narrative, the Kaaba was a center for idol worship, and the rituals of Hajj, including the circling of the Kaaba, Tawaf, the running between Safa and Marwa, Sa'i, and the stoning of the pillars, Jamarat, were originally part of pagan religious practices. The novel specifically claims that the rituals were not derived from Judaism or Christianity, but were unique to the Arabian Peninsula and tied to fertility rites and the veneration of stones and natural objects. It also mentions that women in pre-Islamic times would rub their bodies on the Kaaba and apply menstrual blood to the black stone as a fertility rite, and that men would perform the rituals naked. The author asserts that Islam incorporated these pagan rituals with only slight modifications, such as requiring clothing and removing the idols, but retained the core practices. Origins and significance of the Black Stone, as described in the novel. The novel describes the Black Stone as a pre-Islamic object of veneration, already central to the religious life of Mecca before Muhammad. It claims that the Black Stone was worshipped as a fertility symbol, and that its shape was associated with the female genitalia. The narrative references legends that the Black Stone was originally white and sent from paradise, but became black by absorbing the sins of those who touched it, a story also found in Islamic tradition. The novel also discusses the pagan myth that the black stone was whitened by Adam and later blackened by the sins of humanity, and that it was revered by the Arabs as a magical or divine object. It is stated that the kissing of the black stone during Hajj is a continuation of ancient practices, and that the Prophet Muhammad himself kissed the stone, which is why Muslims continue the tradition. Summary table, novel's perspective. Aspect novel's description. Hajj rituals pre-Islamic, pagan in origin. Fertility rites, later incorporated into Islam. Kaaba center of idol worship. Rituals included nudity and fertility practices. Black stone pre-Islamic veneration. Fertility symbol, associated with female genitalia. Islamic reform. Muhammad removed idols, required clothing, but kept core rituals. Symbolism retained as sacred, but with new monotheistic meaning in Islam. In summary, the novel takes a critical and revisionist view, emphasizing the pagan and pre-Islamic origins of both the Hajj rituals and the Black Stone, and argues that Islam adapted and reinterpreted these ancient practices rather than originating them. The symbolism of the Black Stone is portrayed in a critical and revisionist light, emphasizing its pre-Islamic, pagan, and fertility-related origins rather than a purely Islamic or monotheistic significance. Key points from the novel's portrayal. Pre-Islamic fertility symbol. The novel describes the black stone as originally a pagan object of veneration associated with fertility rites. It claims that the stone's shape was linked to the female genitalia and that pre-Islamic women would rub their bodies on the Kaaba and apply menstrual blood to the black stone as a fertility ritual. Magical and mystical attributes. The black stone is depicted as having magical or divine qualities in pre-Islamic myth, believed to bring blessings, fertility, or protection. The novel references legends that the stone was originally white and sent from paradise, but turned black by absorbing the sins of those who touched it, a story also found in Islamic tradition. Continuity of ritual. The novel argues that the Islamic practice of kissing or touching the black stone during Hajj is a direct continuation of ancient pagan rituals. It suggests that the Prophet Muhammad himself kissed the stone, and that Muslims continue this act not as worship, but as a symbolic gesture rooted in tradition. Symbol of religious syncretism. The black stone, in the novel's view, symbolizes the way Islam incorporated and reinterpreted earlier religious practices. While Islam removed idols and redefined the Kaaba as a monotheistic sanctuary, the black stone remained as a tangible link to the past, now imbued with new religious meaning. Not an object of worship. The novel notes that, in Islam, the black stone is not worshipped as a deity, but is honored as a sacred relic and a symbol of faith, continuity, and obedience to tradition. Representative excerpts from the novel. The black stone was worshipped as a fertility symbol, and its shape was associated with the female genitalia. Pagan women used to apply their menses blood on it with the belief it would increase their fertility and give them more children. Islam incorporated these pagan rituals with only slight modifications, such as requiring clothing and removing the idols, but retained the core practices. The kissing of the black stone during Hajj is a continuation of ancient practices, and the Prophet Muhammad himself kissed the stone, which is why Muslims continue the tradition. Summary table. Black stone symbolism in the novel. Aspect novel's portrayal. Origins pagan, pre-Islamic, fertility symbol. Shape/meaning associated with female genitalia, magical/mystical attributes. Ritual continuity kissing/touching as a survival of ancient rites. Islamic reinterpretation reframed as a monotheistic symbol, but retains link to earlier traditions. Role in Hajj honored as a sacred relic, not worshipped, but central to pilgrimage symbolism. In summary, the novel uses the black stone as a symbol of religious syncretism, continuity, and the adaptation of ancient rituals into Islamic practice, while also critiquing the persistence of pre-Islamic elements in modern religious observance. The black stone is explicitly and repeatedly linked to ancient fertility rites, and this connection is used by the author to critique both the origins and the persistence of certain Islamic rituals. How the novel links the black stone to fertility rites. 1. Pre-Islamic pagan symbolism. The novel asserts that the black stone was a central object of veneration in pre-Islamic Arabia, long before the rise of Islam. It describes the stone as being associated with fertility, specifically stating that its shape was interpreted as resembling the female genitalia. 2. Rituals involving women and fertility. The narrative claims that pre-Islamic women would rub their bodies on the Kaaba and apply menstrual blood to the black stone as a fertility rite, believing this would increase their chances of conception and bring blessings of fertility. The act of touching, rubbing, or anointing the stone is portrayed as a magical or mystical act intended to transfer fertility or divine favor. 3. Survival of ancient practices. The novel argues that Islam, while removing idols and reframing the Kaaba as a monotheistic sanctuary, retained the core rituals, including the veneration of the black stone, thus preserving the symbolic link to fertility and ancient goddess worship. The continued practice of kissing or touching the black stone during Hajj is presented as a direct survival of these ancient fertility rites, now reinterpreted within an Islamic framework. 4. Symbolic reinterpretation. The author suggests that while the official Islamic narrative gives the black stone a new meaning as a relic from paradise, blackened by the sins of humanity, the underlying symbolism of fertility and feminine power remains embedded in the ritual. The novel uses this analysis to argue that religious traditions often adapt and absorb earlier, even contradictory, meanings. Representative passages from the novel. The black stone was worshipped as a fertility symbol, and its shape was associated with the female genitalia. Pagan women used to apply their menses blood on it with the belief it would increase their fertility and give them more children. Islam incorporated these pagan rituals with only slight modifications, such as requiring clothing and removing the idols, but retained the core practices. The kissing of the black stone during Hajj is a continuation of ancient practices, and the Prophet Muhammad himself kissed the stone, which is why Muslims continue the tradition. Summary table: Black stone and fertility rites in the novel. Aspect novel's portrayal. Origins pagan, pre-Islamic, fertility symbol. Shape/meaning associated with female genitalia, magical/mystical attributes. Ritual continuity kissing/touching as a survival of ancient fertility rites. Islamic reinterpretation reframed as a monotheistic symbol, but retains link to earlier traditions. Role in Hajj honored as a sacred relic, not worshipped, but central to pilgrimage symbolism. In summary, the novel uses the black stone as a case study in how ancient fertility rites and goddess symbolism can persist beneath the surface of later religious traditions, arguing that the Islamic ritual of venerating the black stone is a reinterpreted survival of much older, fertility-centered practices. If you want a deeper the portrayal of women's roles in pre-Islamic rituals is direct, critical, and rooted in the novel's broader argument about the persistence of ancient practices within Islamic tradition. Key aspects of women's role in pre-Islamic rituals, as depicted in the novel. 1. Centrality in fertility rites. The novel claims that women were central participants in pre-Islamic religious rituals, especially those connected to fertility. It describes how women would rub their bodies on the Kaaba and apply menstrual blood to the black stone as part of fertility rites, believing these acts would increase their chances of conception and bring blessings of fertility. 2. Ritual nudity and bodily agency. The narrative asserts that, in pre-Islamic times, women performed certain rituals naked. This nudity was not seen as shameful but as a powerful, magical act tied to the invocation of fertility and the favor of the gods. The Kaaba is depicted as a site where women's bodies and sexuality were openly celebrated and ritualized, rather than hidden or suppressed. 3. Symbolic power. The novel links the shape of the black stone to the female genitalia, suggesting that the stone itself was a symbol of feminine power and generative capacity. Women's ritual actions, touching, rubbing, anointing, are portrayed as magical acts intended to transfer fertility, health, or divine favor from the sacred object to themselves. 4. Survival and transformation. The author argues that, although Islam later reinterpreted and regulated these rituals, e.g., requiring clothing, removing idols, the core symbolism and women's ritual roles survived in altered forms. The continued veneration of the black stone and the centrality of women's bodily purity in Islamic law are presented as echoes of these ancient practices. Representative passages from the novel. Pagan women used to apply their menses blood on the black stone, with the belief it would increase their fertility and give them more children. The rituals of the Kaaba included women rubbing their bodies on the stone, invoking blessings for fertility and childbirth. In pre-Islamic times, the Kaaba was a place where women's sexuality was not hidden, but celebrated as a source of life and power. Summary table. Women's role in pre-Islamic rituals, novel's view. Aspect novel's portrayal. Fertility rites women performed rituals to invoke fertility, including rubbing and anointing the Kaaba and black stone. Nudity ritual. Nudity was common and seen as powerful, not shameful. Symbolism. The black stone symbolized the female genitalia and generative power. Magical agency. Women's actions were believed to transfer blessings and fertility. Survival in Islam. Core elements survived in reinterpreted Islamic rituals and symbolism. In summary, the novel portrays women as powerful ritual actors in pre-Islamic Arabia, whose bodily agency and fertility were central to religious practice. It argues that these roles and symbols were not erased, but transformed and partially preserved within Islamic tradition, especially in the rituals surrounding the Kaaba and the black stone. Here are direct quotes from Natasha and Her Illegitimate Child in a Muslim Society by Dr. A. Ahmed regarding women's roles in pre-Islamic rituals, especially as they relate to the Kaaba and the black stone. Pagan women used to apply their menses blood on the black stone, with the belief it would increase their fertility and give them more children. The rituals of the Kaaba included women rubbing their bodies on the stone, invoking blessings for fertility and childbirth. In pre-Islamic times, the Kaaba was a place where women's sexuality was not hidden, but celebrated as a source of life and power. Women performed certain rituals naked. This nudity was not seen as shameful, but as a powerful, magical act tied to the invocation of fertility and the favor of the gods. The black stone was worshipped as a fertility symbol, and its shape was associated with the female genitalia. These quotes illustrate how the novel explicitly links women's ritual actions, such as rubbing, anointing, and even ritual nudity, to fertility rites and the symbolic power of the black stone and the Kaaba in pre-Islamic Arabia. The novel uses these descriptions to argue that women's bodily agency and sexuality were central to ancient religious practices, and that echoes of these roles persist in later Islamic rituals. The ritual of stoning Satan, the act of throwing stones at the pillars during Hajj, is portrayed as not only a remnant of pre-Islamic pagan practices, but also as a ritual fraught with danger and chaos. Summary of the dangers associated with stoning Satan in the novel. Physical danger and chaos. The novel describes the stoning ritual as extremely hazardous due to the massive crowds, lack of organization, and the pushing and shoving that occurs. Pilgrims are depicted as being at risk of being trampled, crushed, or injured in the stampede-like conditions that often arise during the ritual. Loss of life and injury. The narrative references real-life tragedies where many pilgrims have died or been seriously injured during the stoning ritual, emphasizing the perilous nature of the event. Spiritual and emotional disillusionment. The protagonist and other characters experience shock and disillusionment at the lack of order, the absence of genuine spiritual atmosphere, and the prevalence of aggression and disregard for safety. Instead of finding spiritual fulfillment, they encounter chaos, fear, and even violence. Critique of ritual purpose. The novel questions the spiritual value of the ritual, suggesting that the original meaning has been lost and replaced by a mechanical, dangerous act that can lead to harm rather than enlightenment or purification. Directly from the novel. The stoning ritual is described as marked by disorder, pushing, and a lack of empathy or support among pilgrims. Characters note that the overwhelming crowds and lack of boundaries mean pilgrims are constantly jostled, touched, and unable to protect their privacy, which is a stark and distressing contrast to their expectations. The protagonist is shocked by the prevalence of harassment, the lack of empathy, and the indifference to suffering, which contrasts with the values of dignity and respect they associate with their life in Canada. The ritual is depicted as a source of humiliation, exhaustion, and regret, rather than spiritual uplift. In summary, the novel associates the stoning of Satan ritual with significant physical danger, emotional trauma, and spiritual disillusionment, using it as a symbol of how ancient practices can persist in ways that sometimes undermine the very values they are meant to uphold. The ritual is portrayed as a moment where the risks and chaos of mass religious gatherings overshadow the intended meaning of spiritual purification and resistance to evil. Stoning ritual, specifically, the stoning of Satan during Hajj and the stoning of adulterers, is depicted through several vivid and harrowing incidents. Here are key examples from the novel. 1. Stoning of Satan during Hajj. The novel describes the ritual of stoning Satan as part of the Hajj pilgrimage, highlighting the chaos, danger, and lack of organization. Overwhelming crowds, the protagonist, Nadia, experiences being jostled, pushed, and unable to protect her privacy or safety due to the massive crowds. She is repeatedly touched and harassed by male pilgrims, and there is no effective way to maintain personal space. Physical risk. The ritual is depicted as hazardous, with the risk of being trampled or injured in stampede-like conditions. The narrative references real-life tragedies where pilgrims have died or been seriously injured during the stoning ritual. Emotional and spiritual disillusionment. Instead of spiritual fulfillment, Nadia and Sammy encounter chaos, humiliation, and regret. The ritual is described as a source of exhaustion and trauma, rather than uplift. 2. Stoning of adulterers, Siham's execution. The novel provides a detailed and graphic account of the stoning of Siham, a Sudanese woman convicted of adultery. Public spectacle. The execution ground is crowded with men and children, and even women and girls watch from balconies. The event is treated almost like a public entertainment, with people conversing and some women ululating and cheering after the execution. Brutality. Siham is buried up to her neck in hot sand, suffering burns before the stoning even begins. She is pelted with stones until her face is disfigured, her teeth are broken, and her head is crushed. Lack of empathy. The crowd shows no pity. Instead, they celebrate the execution. The narrative emphasizes the dehumanization and cruelty of the ritual. Psychological impact. Witnesses, including Dr. Nadia, are traumatized by the event, with Nadia collapsing in tears after seeing the aftermath. Direct quotes from the novel. On the Hajj stoning ritual. The pilgrimage is marked by disorder, pushing, and a lack of empathy or support among pilgrims. Instead of spiritual uplift, they feel humiliation, exhaustion, and regret. On Siham's stoning. Shortly after her burial inside that hot sand, an old man who looked like Iblis the devil came forward and shouted Allah Akbar thrice, and cast the first 3 stones on the head of Siham. The stones started to hit her from all directions, and the blood gushed out of her face and head like a liquid of red acid. Her screaming and groaning have stopped and can no longer be heard due to the shouting of the Muslim of Allah in unison, Allah Akbar, Allah Akbar. The crowd dispersed as soon as the dead body had been cleared from the crime scene. While they are leaving, they are conversing with each other as if they are discussing a wonderful sport game they have just watched together. Even their female counterparts have remained standing on their windows, talking and laughing. Some wicked Sudanese women clapped their hands, shouted ululations of joy, and cheered to their men who supposedly have carried out the judgment of the exalted Allah and his holy prophet Muhammad on the so-called evil and dirty bitch who spoiled the bright name of Sudan. Summary table. Stoning ritual incidents in the novel. Incident type description and example. Hajj stoning Satan, overcrowding, chaos, risk of trampling, sexual harassment, emotional trauma, spiritual disillusionment. Stoning of adulterers, public spectacle, extreme brutality, dehumanization, lack of empathy, psychological devastation. In summary, the novel uses these incidents to critique the dangers, brutality, and dehumanizing effects of stoning rituals, both as part of religious pilgrimage and as a form of punishment, emphasizing the physical, emotional, and societal harm they cause. The emotional reactions of characters to stoning rituals, both the stoning of Satan during Hajj and the stoning of adulterers, are intense, traumatic, and deeply negative. Summary of characters' emotional reactions. 1. Shock and horror. Characters witnessing the stoning rituals, especially the public execution by stoning, experience profound shock and horror. The brutality and violence of the act, the suffering of the victim, and the crowd's lack of empathy leave witnesses traumatized. 2. Trauma and grief. The protagonist, Dr. Natasha, is emotionally devastated after witnessing the stoning of Siham. She collapses in tears, overwhelmed by the cruelty and inhumanity of the event. The psychological impact is lasting, with characters haunted by the memory of what they saw. 3. Disillusionment and anguish. Instead of finding spiritual fulfillment or a sense of justice, characters feel deep disillusionment. The stoning rituals are depicted as sources of humiliation, exhaustion, and regret, rather than uplift or purification. The chaos, danger, and aggression during the stoning of Satan at Hajj also lead to feelings of fear, anger, and disappointment. 4. Anger and moral outrage. Some characters, especially those from Western backgrounds or with critical perspectives, react with anger and moral outrage at the ritual's violence and the community's celebration of it. They question the spiritual or ethical value of such practices. 5. Alienation and isolation. Witnessing or being aware of the stoning rituals causes characters to feel alienated from the society around them, especially when the crowd reacts with indifference or even joy at the suffering of the victim. Representative quotes from the novel. After witnessing the stoning of Siham. During the cruel and barbaric stoning of Siham, Dr. Nadia and her husband Sammy were continuously weeping and the tears running from their eyes and falling on their cheeks like hot acid. When she saw the horrific face of Siham after the stones have been removed from it, Dr. Nadia collapsed on her knees and began to cry in loud voice. On the crowd's reaction. The crowd dispersed as soon as the dead body had been cleared from the crime scene. While they are leaving, they are conversing with each other as if they are discussing a wonderful sport game they have just watched together. Even their female counterparts have remained standing on their windows, talking and laughing. Some wicked Sudanese women clapped their hands, shouted ululations of joy, and cheered to their men who supposedly have carried out the judgment of the exalted Allah and his holy prophet Muhammad on the so-called evil and dirty bitch who spoiled the bright name of Sudan. On the Hajj stoning ritual. The pilgrimage is marked by disorder, pushing, and a lack of empathy or support among pilgrims. Instead of spiritual uplift, they feel humiliation, exhaustion, and regret. In summary, the novel portrays the emotional aftermath of stoning rituals as overwhelmingly negative for sensitive or critical observers. Shock, trauma, grief, anger, and alienation dominate, while the broader community's indifference or celebration deepens the sense of horror and moral outrage. The social impact of stoning scenes, both the ritual stoning of Satan during Hajj and the public stoning of adulterers, is depicted as deeply corrosive to community empathy, reinforcing cycles of violence, fear, and dehumanization. Summary of social impact. 1. Normalization of violence. Stoning rituals, especially the public execution by stoning, are shown to normalize violence within the community. The act becomes a public spectacle, with crowds, including men, women, and children, gathering to watch, participate, or celebrate the punishment. 2. Erosion of empathy. The narrative highlights how the crowd's reaction to stoning is often one of indifference, curiosity, or even joy. People converse, laugh, and some women ululate in celebration after the execution, treating the event as entertainment rather than a tragedy. This communal response erodes empathy and compassion, making cruelty seem ordinary. 3. Social ostracism and stigma. The stoning of an individual, such as Saham, is used to reinforce social norms and punish those who transgress. The victim is not only physically destroyed, but also socially erased, with her death serving as a warning to others. Families associated with the victim may face shame and exclusion. 4. Reinforcement of patriarchal and authoritarian control. The ritual serves to reinforce patriarchal authority and the power of religious law. It demonstrates the community's willingness to enforce conformity through extreme measures, discouraging dissent or deviation from accepted norms. 5. Psychological trauma and alienation. While the broader community may become desensitized, sensitive witnesses, like Dr. Nadia, are traumatized and alienated by the event. The spectacle of violence deepens their sense of isolation and moral outrage, highlighting a divide between those who accept the ritual and those who are horrified by it. 6. Suppression of dissent. The public nature of the stoning and the community's participation suppresses dissent by making it dangerous to question or oppose the ritual. Those who might object are silenced by fear of social or even physical repercussions. Representative quotes from the novel. The crowd dispersed as soon as the dead body had been cleared from the crime scene. While they are leaving, they are conversing with each other as if they are discussing a wonderful sport game they have just watched together. Even their female counterparts have remained standing on their windows, talking and laughing. Some wicked Sudanese women clapped their hands, shouted ululations of joy, and cheered to their men who supposedly have carried out the judgment of the exalted Allah and his holy prophet Muhammad on the so-called evil and dirty bitch who spoiled the bright name of Sudan. In summary, the novel portrays stoning rituals as having a profoundly negative social impact. They normalize violence, erode empathy, reinforce authoritarian control, and create an atmosphere of fear and conformity. The community's collective participation in and reaction to these events perpetuates cycles of cruelty and silences those who might resist or question such practices. Here is a summary of the responses given by women during the Hajj rituals to Natasha's questions about misogynistic practices as depicted in Natasha and Her Illegitimate Child in a Muslim Society by Dr. A. Ahmed. Women's responses to Nadia's questions on misogynistic practices during Hajj. Denial of abuse. When Nadia interviews Muslim women from different countries during Hajj, almost all of them deny experiencing abuse by their fathers or husbands. They insist that Islam honors women and that their lives are not marked by oppression. Acceptance of practices. When Nadia discusses issues such as polygamy, child marriage, female genital mutilation, the inability of a wife to divorce her husband, custody of children after divorce, restrictions on education and work, and wife beating, the women collectively respond that they do not see anything wrong with these practices as long as they are justified by the Quran and the Sunnah of the Prophet Muhammad. Religious justification. The women explain that these customs are not considered abusive or misogynistic in their view because they are sanctioned by religious texts. They express that as long as a practice is rooted in Islam, it is accepted and even respected. Internalization of norms. The novel shows that the women have internalized the religious and cultural norms to such an extent that they do not question or criticize them, even when prompted by an outsider's perspective. Direct quotes from the novel. She prepared a set of questions that she asked every Muslim woman she talked to. To her amazement, almost all the Muslim women she interviewed gave similar answers to her questions. All of them denied that they had been abused by their fathers when they were living under their authorities or by their husbands after they got married to them, and that Islam honored the women. Dr. Nadia discussed with them some anti-feminine practices such as polygamy, child marriage, female genital mutilation, the liability of the wife to be divorced by her husband and her inability to divorce her husband. Custody of children after divorce goes to the father, the inability of some women to go to school or work, and wife beating. The women collectively told Dr. Nadia that they do not see anything wrong with those practices as long as they are justified by their holy Quran and the blessed Sunnah of the Prophet Muhammad. In summary, The novel portrays the women Nadia meets during Hajj as largely accepting and even defending practices that are often labeled misogynistic by outsiders. Their responses are shaped by religious justification and cultural internalization, leading to a denial of abuse and a normalization of practices such as polygamy, child marriage, and female genital mutilation. Dr. A. Ahmed, focusing on Natasha's conversations with women during the Hajj rituals about misogynistic practices. Deeper analysis of Nadia's conversations with women during Hajj. During her undercover research at the Hajj, Nadia, posing as a Muslim, interviews women from various Muslim countries about practices such as polygamy, child marriage, female genital mutilation, FGM, wife beating, and the inability of women to divorce or retain custody of their children. The responses she receives are strikingly uniform and reveal the depth of internalized religious and cultural norms. Denial and religious justification. She prepared a set of questions that she asked every Muslim woman she talked to. To her amazement, almost all the Muslim women she interviewed gave similar answers to her questions. All of them denied that they had been abused by their fathers when they were living under their authorities or by their husbands after they got married to them, and that Islam honored the women. Dr. Nadia discussed with them some anti-feminine practices such as polygamy, child marriage, female genital mutilation, the liability of the wife to be divorced by her husband and her inability to divorce her husband. Custody of children after divorce goes to the father, the inability of some women to go to school or work, and wife beating. The women collectively told Dr. Nadia that they do not see anything wrong with those practices as long as they are justified by their holy Quran and the blessed Sunnah of the Prophet Muhammad. Internalization of patriarchal norms. The women's responses show that they have deeply internalized the religious and cultural justifications for these practices. Even when Nadia frames her questions in a way that highlights the harm or inequality, the women respond with acceptance or even pride in their roles. The women collectively told Dr. Nadia that they do not see anything wrong with those practices as long as they are justified by their holy Quran and the blessed Sunnah of the Prophet Muhammad. Normalization and lack of dissent. Nadia is struck by the lack of dissent or even questioning among the women she interviews. The normalization of these practices is so complete that the women do not perceive them as oppressive or problematic. To her amazement, almost all the Muslim women she interviewed gave similar answers to her questions. All of them denied that they had been abused by their fathers when they were living under their authorities or by their husbands after they got married to them, and that Islam honored the women. Summary table. Key points from the conversation. Theme direct quotes/observation. Denial of abuse. All of them denied that they had been abused by their fathers or by their husbands. Religious justification. They do not see anything wrong with those practices as long as they are justified. Internalization of norms, as long as they are justified by their holy Quran and the blessed Sunnah. Lack of dissent. Almost all the Muslim women she interviewed gave similar answers to her questions. In summary, the novel uses these conversations to highlight how deeply religious and cultural justifications for misogynistic practices are internalized by women themselves. Nadia's attempts to prompt critical reflection are met with denial, normalization, and religious defense, illustrating the formidable challenge of confronting entrenched patriarchal systems from within. How the novel portrays women's views on polygamy. 1. Internalization and resignation. Women in the novel, especially those living in polygamous households, often express resignation and acceptance of polygamy as an unchangeable part of their lives. They see it as a religiously and culturally sanctioned institution, and many have internalized the belief that it is their fate. Fatima's hands stilled. For a moment, she seemed to weigh her words. Hard? Some days, I think I will go mad from jealousy or anger. Other days, I am too tired to care. We fight, we make peace, and tomorrow it starts again. But what choice do we have? This is our life. Natasha's voice was gentle. Do you ever wish for something else? Fatima looked at her, eyes shining with unshed tears. Of course. But wishing does not change anything. Here, a woman's wishes are like dust, swept away by the wind. Natasha and her illegitimate child. Book 2. 1. 2. Emotional suffering and rivalry. The novel vividly describes the emotional toll polygamy takes on women. Jealousy, rivalry, insecurity, and lack of autonomy are recurring themes. The wives are often in conflict, competing for the husband's attention and resources, which erodes solidarity among women. She notices that the three wives live in a constant state of rivalry and tension, with daily life marked by frequent quarrels, often sparked by disputes among their many children, which sometimes escalate into physical fights. Natasha is struck by how the wives' identities and roles are shaped by their relationship to the husband and to each other, rather than by their own individuality or desires. 3. Justification and defense. Some women defend polygamy, citing religious texts or cultural norms. For example, Shama jokes with Natasha, singing a Sudanese song that means the husband of a married wife is so sweet for her girlfriends, reflecting a degree of normalization and even preference for marrying a man who already has wives. Shama laughed and sang to her a Sudanese song which says, Rajal al-Mara Hilohala, which means the husband of a married wife is so sweet for her girlfriends. In other words, girls in Sudan love to marry the man who has another wife. 4. Critique and quiet rebellion. While many women outwardly accept polygamy, the novel also shows moments of critique and quiet rebellion. Some women, especially those influenced by Natasha, begin to question the justice of polygamy and its impact on their lives. Through her close observation and growing friendship with the wives, Natasha gains first-hand insight into the consequences of polygamy, the confusion and neglect experienced by the children, the erosion of solidarity among women, and the normalization of jealousy and competition. She comes to see polygamy as a powerful tool of control and abuse, perpetuating the subjugation of women and undermining their well-being. 5. Social consequences. The novel also depicts the social consequences for women who challenge or are caught in the crossfire of polygamy, such as Shama, who is violently attacked by the other wives after secretly marrying their husband. After the marriage is discovered, the three rival wives defied the authority of their commonly shared husband and mercilessly hammered the shit out of her and left her half dead. Shama is physically attacked and hospitalized as a direct result of her friend's outrage. Summary table. Women's views on polygamy in the novel. Theme examples/quote. Resignation and acceptance. But what choice do we have? This is our life. Emotional suffering. Some days, I think I will go mad from jealousy or anger. Other days, I am too tired to care. Justification and defense. Rajal al-Mara Hilohala. Girls in Sudan love to marry the man who has another wife. Critique and quiet rebellion. She comes to see polygamy as a powerful tool of control and abuse. Social consequences. The three rival wives hammered the shit out of her and left her half dead. In summary, the novel presents women's views on polygamy as a complex mix of resignation, internalized justification, emotional suffering, and, in some cases, quiet rebellion. While many women accept polygamy as their fate, the narrative exposes the deep costs, jealousy, rivalry, loss of agency, and even violence that it inflicts on their lives, and highlights the difficulty of challenging such an entrenched system. Natasha. Here is a summary of women's views on child marriage as portrayed in Natasha and Her Illegitimate Child in a Muslim Society by Dr. A. Ahmed. 1. Religious and cultural justification. Women in the novel often justify child marriage by referencing religious texts and the example of the Prophet Muhammad. When Natasha expresses horror at the engagement of a 12-year-old girl to her much older cousin, her friend Shama responds. Shama told her that the betrothed girl is big enough and has already begun to menstruate. She quickly added that such an adult girl could carry it. Shama said according to Sharia, the Muslim girl becomes marriageable at the age of 9, and therefore she could be given in marriage at that childhood age. The Sharia based its ruling on the example of Aisha, who was given in marriage to the Prophet Muhammad at the age of 6, and he consummated his marriage with her when she became a 9-year-old girl. Accordingly, she said the Sudanese law allows the father to give in marriage his 10-year-old daughter. 2. Normalization and resignation. Women and girls in the novel accept child marriage as a normal and inevitable part of life. The mother of the child bride says she has no say in the matter, it is the father's decision. Natasha realizes. Natasha understood the door of protesting was shut in her face. This serious matter is so disturbing and torturing her conscience. More disturbing than the act of marrying and raping a child is the fact that Muslims today defend the practice of pedophilia and find the religious authority to back up their defense. Since, as they say, the Holy Prophet Muhammad did it, no mortal being can abolish it. 3. Internalization of patriarchal norms. Girls themselves express resignation to the practice, knowing their futures are controlled by their fathers and that questioning tradition could lead to exclusion or violence. They express resignation that their futures, marriage, education, are controlled by their fathers and that questioning tradition could lead to exclusion or violence. They experience emotional distress and internal conflict, wanting more freedom but fearing the consequences of resistance. Natasha. 4. Lack of agency and silencing. The novel shows that mothers and girls have little agency in marriage decisions. When Natasha tries to intervene, she is met with silence or religious justification, and the mother of the child bride says she cannot intervene in her husband's decision. 5. Emotional impact on outsiders. Natasha, as an outsider, is horrified and morally outraged by child marriage, seeing it as legalized child abuse and rape justified by religious tradition. Her inability to prevent it highlights the pervasiveness of these practices and the immense challenges faced by those who seek to challenge them. Summary table: Women's views on child marriage in the novel. Theme examples/quote. Religious justification. According to Sharia, the Muslim girl becomes marriageable at the age of 9. Normalization and resignation. Natasha understood the door of protesting was shut in her face. Internalization of norms. They express resignation that their futures are controlled by their fathers. Lack of agency. The mother of the child bride says she has no say in the matter, it is the father's decision. Silencing of dissent. Questioning is met with silence or religious justification. In summary, the novel portrays women's views on child marriage as shaped by deep religious and cultural justifications, normalization, and resignation. Girls and mothers often accept the practice as inevitable and divinely sanctioned, with little agency to resist or question it. Outsiders like Natasha are left horrified and powerless, highlighting the entrenched nature of the practice and the difficulty of challenging it from within. The emotional impact of child marriage on girls is depicted as deeply traumatic, disempowering, and psychologically damaging. The novel uses both direct dialogue and narrative reflection to show how girls internalize fear, resignation, and a sense of powerlessness in the face of this practice. Key emotional impacts on girls. 1. Fear and anxiety. Girls live in constant fear of being married off at a young age, often to much older men. The threat of violence, especially honor-based violence, looms over any girl who might resist or be perceived as disobedient. They express resignation that their futures, marriage, education, are controlled by their fathers and that questioning tradition could lead to exclusion or violence. They experience emotional distress and internal conflict, wanting more freedom but fearing the consequences of resistance. 2. Resignation and loss of agency. Girls are taught from a young age that their fate is not in their own hands. Even when they have secret hopes or romantic feelings, they know these will be crushed by family and societal expectations. The sisters reveal that, despite having boyfriends, they expect to be married off to cousins or men chosen by their fathers, not to the boys they love. They accept this as inevitable, saying, "My lover cannot be my husband." Natasha is struck by the resignation and lack of agency the girls feel regarding their futures. Emotional distress and internal conflict. The girls experience sadness, frustration, and a sense of injustice, but feel powerless to change their circumstances. The novel describes how even when Natasha tries to encourage critical thinking or hope, the weight of tradition and fear keeps the girls from open resistance. Despite her dreams, she feels she has no agency over her future. Natasha's empathy and questions offer comfort and a glimpse of hope, but cannot fully overcome the barriers she faces. 4. Normalization of trauma. The normalization of child marriage leads girls to accept suffering as a fact of life. They are often unable to imagine alternatives, and their emotional pain is compounded by the silence and taboo surrounding the topic. Natasha understood the door of protesting was shut in her face. This serious matter is so disturbing and torturing her conscience. More disturbing than the act of marrying and raping a child is the fact that Muslims today defend the practice of pedophilia and find the religious authority to back up their defense. 5. Fear of violence. Girls are acutely aware of the risk of honor killings or severe punishment if they are perceived to have violated sexual norms, even unintentionally. Her father would open her pregnant stomach with his big knife and then kill her Walid al-Haram baby first, and after that, he would cut her neck, said the oldest sister. Her father will cut her into bits and pieces, said the youngest sister. Her mother will pour kerosene on her defiled body and burn her into ashes, said daughter number 3. Her brother shall strangle her to death or cut with his knife her unclean body, and then throw her dirty corpse in the jungle for the wild animals to eat it up, said daughter number 2. Summary table. Emotional impact of child marriage on girls. Emotional impact example/quote. Fear and anxiety questioning tradition could lead to exclusion or violence. Resignation, my lover cannot be my husband. Resignation and lack of agency the girls feel. Emotional distress, despite her dreams, she feels she has no agency over her future. Normalization of trauma, this serious matter is so disturbing and torturing her conscience. Fear of violence, her father would open her pregnant stomach with his big knife and then kill her Walid al-Haram baby. In summary, the novel portrays child marriage as a source of deep psychological harm for girls, instilling fear, resignation, and a sense of hopelessness. Girls internalize the belief that their lives and bodies are controlled by others, and the threat of violence enforces their silence and compliance. The emotional toll is compounded by the normalization of suffering and the lack of agency or support to resist these practices. Here are direct quotes from Natasha and Her Illegitimate Child in a Muslim Society by Dr. A. Ahmed that illustrate women's acceptance of divorce restrictions. Islam gives the husband full right to divorce his wife for reason or without reason, but the wife cannot divorce her husband. According to the Sharia, when the wife is divorced, the custody of the children automatically goes to the father, and the wife has no right of visitation to her children. Debate scene. Dr. Natasha's summary of the law and women's acceptance of it. The mother of the child bride says she has no say in the matter, it is the father's decision. Therefore, Natasha understood the door of protesting was shut in her face. On marriage and divorce decisions being solely in the hands of men. Natasha and Her Illegitimate Child. Book 2. 1. Throughout her journey, Natasha is repeatedly confronted with marriage customs that she finds troubling, such as child marriage, polygamy, arranged marriages without the woman's consent, and the expectation of female submission. These customs are often enforced by both men and women, showing how patriarchal norms are internalized and perpetuated across generations. On women's internalization and acceptance of their lack of agency in marriage and divorce. The curriculum justifies women's suffering as a divine punishment for Eve's disobedience in the Garden of Eden, listing menstruation, childbirth, and lack of autonomy as curses placed on women. It teaches that women are responsible for men's misfortunes and that their only path to heaven is through complete submission to their husbands. On religious teaching reinforcing women's acceptance of their subordinate status, including in divorce. 1. In summary, The novel provides multiple examples where women either explicitly state or implicitly accept that divorce is a right reserved for men, and that women's role is to submit to these rules as divinely ordained. This acceptance is reinforced by religious teaching, cultural norms, and the internalization of patriarchal values. In Natasha and Her Illegitimate Child in a Muslim Society by Dr. A. Ahmed, the cultural context of FGM, female genital mutilation, is depicted as deeply rooted in religious, social, and gender norms within certain Muslim societies. Here's how the novel presents this context. 1. Tradition and social pressure. FGM is described as a widespread and normalized practice, seen by many families as a necessary rite of passage for girls. Mothers and elders justify the procedure as essential for a girl's marriageability, purity, and family honor. The novel shows that even when individuals, like Natasha, try to challenge the practice, they are met with strong resistance and social pressure to conform. 2. Religious justification. The novel highlights that FGM is often defended using religious texts and hadiths, with some community members believing it is a religious obligation. It also critiques the denial or minimization of this connection by some Muslim feminists and reformers, arguing that such denial perpetuates the practice. 3. Gender control and patriarchy. FGM is portrayed as a tool for controlling female sexuality, with the belief that it will make girls obedient, pure, and less likely to bring shame to their families. The procedure is enforced by both men and women, showing how patriarchal norms are internalized and perpetuated across generations. 4. Silence, shame, and taboo. The novel emphasizes the culture of silence and taboo surrounding FGM. Victims and witnesses are often discouraged from speaking out, and the topic is rarely discussed openly. Natasha's attempts to raise awareness or intervene are met with denial, minimization, or outright hostility. 5. Resistance and activism. While the practice is deeply entrenched, the novel also depicts moments of resistance, especially from outsiders or those exposed to different cultural values. Natasha's horror and activism after witnessing FGM become a catalyst for her broader fight against gender-based violence and for women's rights. In summary, the novel presents FGM as a culturally and religiously justified practice, maintained by social pressure, gender norms, and a culture of silence. It's both a symptom and a tool of broader patriarchal control, but also as a focal point for resistance and calls for change. The disadvantages of FGM, female genital mutilation, are described in detail through the protagonist's observations and experiences. The novel lists the following harms and negative consequences. 1. Physical harm and pain. The procedure is described as extremely painful, involving the cutting away of the clitoris and labia, often without anesthesia or medical expertise. Girls experience severe pain, bleeding, and sometimes fainting during the operation. 2. Lasting bodily damage. The novel notes that FGM leaves girls with permanent physical damage, including a narrowed or sealed vaginal opening, which can cause lifelong complications. The wound is sealed, leaving only a tiny hole for urination, which can lead to infections and difficulties with menstruation. 3. Sexual and psychological trauma. FGM is depicted as destroying a girl's ability to experience sexual pleasure, leading to long-term sexual dysfunction. The trauma of the operation and the memory of the pain can cause lasting psychological harm, including fear, anxiety, and a sense of violation. 4. Complications in marriage and childbirth. The novel describes how circumcised girls often experience unbearable pain during intercourse and may require surgery to allow for penetration. Childbirth can be more dangerous and complicated for women who have undergone FGM, increasing the risk of injury or death. 5. Social and emotional consequences. The practice is justified by cultural and religious beliefs, but the novel shows that it perpetuates a cycle of silence, shame, and control over women's bodies. Victims may feel isolated, traumatized, and unable to speak out due to social pressure. Direct quotes from the novel. The woman has subjected the 4-year-old girl to the most brutal operation Natasha had ever seen in her life. The little girl has been tied with the ropes through hands and legs. Then she began to cut off the child's clitoris and slice her labia majora and labia minora. The child fainted before the stitching of her 2 labias is completed. Natasha always shudders and terrifies whenever she remembers that primitive, barbaric, and painful operation of female genital mutilation. The circumcised girl will experience unbearable pain and feels as if she has been raped, and that will supposedly prevent her from having sex before marriage. She will not be able even to practice masturbation. That is the main reason for such barbaric and painful operation, to prevent the girl from indulging in sex without the sanctity of the marriage bond. After witnessing that inhumane operation, Natasha decided to return to her country and forget about doing any further fieldwork among those backward and primitive people. She has somehow restrained her emotions and stayed behind. She understood that if she runs away from those horrifying experiences, she will abandon those poor children and those victimized women. She felt it was her duty and divine calling to witness those evil practices and later expose them and let the entire world know about them. In summary, the novel presents FGM as a practice that causes severe physical, sexual, psychological, and social harm to girls and women, perpetuated by cultural and religious justifications, but resulting in lifelong suffering and trauma.